Hello everyone. Imagine this, a girl comes into your class, but you notice something unusual. She is not wearing shoes. The surprised glances of her classmates and teacher immediately turn to her, but no one dares to ask what happened. Today I will tell you a story that began from this moment and led to an unexpected and touching discovery during the teacher's visit to her home. While we're getting started, write in the comments where you're watching us from. It's interesting to know how many viewers we have from different parts of the world. The teacher, noticing that the girl was barefoot, did not make a scene right in the classroom, but he could see that something was wrong. Her eyes were tired, and her face was frozen in an expression of embarrassment and even fear. During recess, he approached her and quietly asked, "Why are you barefoot? Is everything okay?" The girl just lowered her head and muttered, "Everything is fine, I just forgot." However, her answer did not convince the teacher. This was not a case of children forgetting something out of absent-mindedness. Over the years, he had learned to see what was hidden behind innocent words and decided to find out the truth. When the lessons were over, the teacher went to the principal to discuss the situation. They decided to visit the girl at home, without waiting for the situation to repeat itself. When the teacher approached her house, he saw a dilapidated building on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by deserted courtyards. The girl opened the door, and at that moment her face reflected surprise and confusion. She clearly did not expect a visit from the teacher, but the most shocking thing was yet to come. When the teacher entered the house, he was immediately struck by the silence. There were no familiar sounds of life inside, no television, no conversations, not even the usual noise of pets. The furnishings were extremely modest, old, shabby furniture and minimal things, but what struck the teacher most was what he saw in the corner of the room. On the floor, neatly stacked, lay several pairs of old, very worn-out shoes. They clearly belonged to different people, in size, shape and condition. "These are shoes that kind people bring us," the girl said quietly, "but none of them fit me, and we simply don't have the money for new ones." The teacher felt his heart sink. In that moment, he realized that the reason the girl had come to school barefoot was much deeper than just forgetfulness or carelessness. Her family was poor, the kind that is rarely talked about, but often hidden behind the walls of such homes. However, this story was just beginning. The teacher felt his heart skip a beat. Looking at the girl, he realized that this was not just an episode, but a daily struggle hidden from view. He asked carefully, "Where are your parents? Are they home?" The girl hesitated for a moment, her eyes clouded over, as if she didn't know how to answer. Finally, quietly, almost in a whisper, she said, "Mom works 2 jobs. She's hardly ever home. And Dad, he's gone." The teacher remained standing in the middle of the room, looking around at the plain and almost empty walls. There was a feeling of something unspoken in the air. The girl continued, "Mom tries, but it's still not enough. Sometimes we don't even have money for food. Shoes, that's the last thing we think about." Her words rang out with unexpected force for such a small child. She had been forced to grow up too soon. At that moment, the door to the back room creaked and a little boy came out, the girl's younger brother. He was barefoot and wearing an old t-shirt and worn-out pants. His eyes looked at him with a silent question, "Who is this stranger? And why is he here?" The teacher suddenly realized the gravity of this family's situation. They didn't just live in poverty. They fought for every day, for every piece of bread, for any chance at a better life. "We sometimes get help from the neighbors," the girl continued, lowering her head, "but it's still not enough. And I can't ask my mother. She's so tired. I can see how hard it is for her. She doesn't even know that I don't have shoes, because she leaves for work before I get up and comes home when I'm already asleep." Tears quietly ran into the girl's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away with her sleeve, as if she had become accustomed to not being able to cry. The teacher could not remain indifferent. He felt that he had to do something to help this family, but he did not know where to start. Leaving the family alone, the teacher went outside, but he couldn't forget what he saw inside. This girl, her little brother, their mother who was trying her best to support them. It was a real struggle hidden behind the walls of the old house. He knew that going home with this pain in his heart would not change their lives. It would not change the future of these children. The next day, the teacher returned to school, but this time he was not alone. He gathered colleagues. parents of other children, the local community, and something incredible began to happen. People, having heard the girl's story, began to bring things, clothes, shoes, toys. Someone offered to help the family with home repairs, and someone took it upon themselves to make sure that the children came to school well-fed every day. But the most important thing was yet to come. When the teacher visited the girl again, she was standing on the threshold, with new, clean sneakers on her feet, but her eyes were full of tears. She could not believe that all this was happening to her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly, looking at the teacher. He replied, "Because you deserve it, because no one should be alone in a world like this." The girl stood for a long time on the threshold, looking at her new sneakers, as if she couldn't believe that all this was really happening. But despite the external help that the family began to receive, the teacher felt that there was something more hidden behind her smile, something dark and impenetrable, like a cloud over this family. One day, a few weeks after the first visit, the girl stopped coming to school. The teacher, alarmed by her absence, tried several times to contact her mother, but all attempts were unsuccessful. Anxiety grew in his heart. He felt that something had gone wrong. Finally, deciding not to wait any longer, he headed again to the girl's house. This time no one opened the door. He knocked again silence. The house seemed abandoned, as if all life had left it. The teacher walked around the building and looked in the windows. There was no movement inside, no sound, as if there was no one left. It was as if the family had simply disappeared. The teacher was overcome by a strange premonition. He was about to leave when a neighbor, an elderly woman, came out of the house next door and looked at him suspiciously. "Are you looking for this family?" she asked in a hoarse voice. The teacher nodded. The old woman's gaze darkened, and she lowered her voice, adding, "They are no longer here. The mother was taken to the hospital, and the children to an orphanage. I don't know all the details, but something terrible happened there." The mother completely broke down. These words hit the teacher in the chest. He couldn't believe what he heard. How could this happen? Everything was just starting to get better. He hurried to the hospital, where he guessed the girl's mother might be. When he got there, it turned out that the woman had indeed been hospitalized a few days ago with a severe nervous breakdown. Her condition was extremely serious. Constant work, stress, poverty, chronic fatigue had brought her to the point of no return. In the hospital room, the girl's mother looked as if all the strength had left her body. Her eyes were empty, her face pale and haggard. I let them down," was all she could whisper, unable to hold her teacher's gaze. Tears rolled down her cheeks and her hands shook. She said that the last few months had been like living on a powder keg. Debts were mounting, food was scarce, and work was increasing but money was decreasing. The pressure had become unbearable. "I wanted to do better, but I just couldn't anymore. That night, the kids were hungry and I'd lost my second job. I screamed at them, then at myself. Then everything went black." She burst into tears, covering her face with her hands. It became clear to the teacher that there was much more going on in this family than poverty and a lack of shoes. It was a real tragedy, a tragedy of broken lives and a hopeless struggle with circumstances. He learned that the children had been temporarily taken away by Child Protection Services. This was the point that no one expected, but which had always loomed invisibly on the horizon. The mother's departure from the children's lives was a turning point, and now their future was in jeopardy. The teacher went to the orphanage where the girl and her younger brother were sent. When he finally saw her, she looked completely different. Her eyes were full of longing. Her face was dark with sadness, and in her gaze there was no longer that old spark that once lived in this little girl. Her younger brother sat next to her, his face buried in her shoulder, and cried quietly. They were alone in this cold, strange place. The girl looked up at the teacher and, unable to contain herself, said, Why did all this happen to us? We just wanted to live like everyone else." Her voice trembled, and at that moment the teacher realized the tragedy of this family is not only the loss of their mother, but also the loss of faith that life can be better. The teacher did everything he could. He started looking for support through social services, tried to organize help, but with each passing day it became more and more obvious. Stories like this families happen too often, and it is not always possible to change the course of events. A few months later, the girl's mother, having left the hospital, tried to get the children back, but her condition remained grave. She could not offer them the stability they so badly needed. Social services decided that the children would remain in the shelter for the time being. This story left a deep mark on the teacher. He understood that the world is unfair and that even small acts of kindness cannot always mend the huge cracks in the lives of those who struggle every day to survive. Months passed, but the situation did not improve. The girl's mother, despite attempts to recover, was unable to return to her former life. Her emotional wounds were too deep, and the pressure of circumstances was insurmountable. She was lost in her own despair, and the children continued to remain in the shelter, moving away from their mother with each passing day. The teacher, who continued to care about the fate of the girl and her brother, felt helpless. He visited the orphanage every week, brought gifts, talked to the children, trying to support them, but each time he noticed how their eyes sank deeper into the abyss of sadness. It seemed that each visit was not a consolation, but only a reminder that the world was broken, and no good intentions could fix it. One day, when he came to the orphanage one more time, the girl was sitting in the corner, holding an old toy in her hands, a gift from her mother. Her face was impassive, and her eyes were fixed on the void. The teacher sat down next to her, not knowing how to start the conversation. She was silent, but then suddenly said, "I don't want to go home anymore. It will always be the same there. I'm tired of dreaming about something that will never happen." These words pierced his heart. She was still a child, but her voice sounded tired as an adult, as if she had to bear the burden of the whole family. Her younger brother, on the contrary, still clung to the illusion of return. Every day he said that they would soon be together with their mother, that she would recover and take them home. But the girl, despite her 11 years, already saw through this lie. A few more weeks passed, and one morning brought tragic news. The girl's mother, despite the support of psychologists and doctors, had committed suicide. It was a shock to everyone, but especially to the children. In the letter she left, the woman wrote that she could no longer live with the thought that she had failed her children. Her death was the last straw in a story that seemed doomed to tragedy from the start. The girl, having learned about this, did not shed a tear. She simply sat silently, clenching her hands into fists, as if all the pain in the world had frozen inside her. Her brother was broken, his last hopes had collapsed, and he fell into a deep silence. The teacher could not believe that this family, once full of life and hope, had now fallen apart completely. In despair, he began to look for all possible ways to help the children, through the courts, social programs, charities, but all the bureaucratic procedures were so slow that it seemed that the children were sinking deeper and deeper into an abyss from which they could not be pulled out. One day, when the teacher came to the orphanage again, the girl was not in her usual place. The caregivers told him that she had been taken to another family, a foster family, far outside the city. She would never return. Her younger brother remained in the orphanage, as a new family could not be found for both children. This separation was the final blow to their bond. The girl and her brother, inseparable since birth, were now separated. The teacher stood at the door of the orphanage for a long time, trying to comprehend that it was all over. He wanted to believe that the girl had a better future in a new family, but he knew that the trauma she had experienced would be with her forever. The fates of these children were wounds that would never heal. It was a story about how the world can be cruel and unfair to those who are weaker and more defenseless. Several years passed. The teacher was still working at the school, but this story had changed him forever. He no longer believed that good intentions could overcome the harsh realities of life. But every time he saw new children in the classroom, he reminded himself that every story was an opportunity to do something that would change at least part of this reality. The fate of the girl and her brother remains unknown. They became a symbol of those children who fall into cruel circumstances and get lost in the system. But in the teacher's heart there will always be a memory of the girl who once came to school without shoes, carrying a burden much greater than anyone could imagine. Several years had passed since the girl had been transferred to a foster family, and the teacher continued to live with a feeling of incompleteness. He tried to find her through social services, through acquaintances and friends, but the trail was lost. He could not get rid of the thought that her story was not yet finished, Or maybe he simply could not come to terms with the fact that all his care and efforts did not bring real results. One day, on an ordinary day, when he was teaching a class, the principal suddenly came to him. "They are waiting for you in the teacher's room. Right now," he said briefly, and the teacher, frowning, apologized to the class and left. In the teacher's room, an unexpected guest was waiting for him, a young woman in a formal suit, who introduced herself as a social worker. She looked nervous, and on the table in front of her lay a folder with documents. "Sorry to come so suddenly," she began, opening the folder. "I'm here about a matter that you might be interested in. It concerns a girl you once took care of, the girl with no shoes." The teacher's heart began to beat faster. He instantly remembered her name, her eyes full of sadness, and the moment when their paths diverged. "Did you find her?" he asked, not believing his ears. The woman nodded, but there was something strange in her gaze. "She came back to town," the social worker said, as if choosing her words carefully, "but things didn't turn out the way we hoped." Over the years, changes had occurred in the foster family that had a profound effect on her fate. The teacher froze, not understanding where she was going with this. "What do you mean?" he asked, feeling a growing sense of unease. The woman continued, "The foster family, unfortunately, turned out to be dysfunctional. On the outside, they looked like caring and noble people, but behind closed doors, terrible things happened. The girl was subjected to emotional and even physical abuse. She tried to escape several times, but each time she was brought back. Eventually, when she got older, she managed to leave for good." These words sounded like a bolt from the blue. The teacher was shocked. He could not believe that instead of being saved, the girl ended up in even more terrible conditions. He felt a wave of rage and helplessness growing in his chest. "And what's wrong with her now?" he asked, almost in a whisper. The woman sighed. "She recently showed up in town. She's not a child anymore. She's almost 18, but she's had a hard life. We found out that she lives on the streets, wanders around, and often gets into trouble. A few days ago, the police picked her up. She had debts and got into trouble." The news was like a knife to the heart. The teacher couldn't believe that the girl he cared about so much had gone through even more grief. But suddenly the social worker added something else. "She asked to see you. She said she remembers you and that you were the only one who ever cared about her. She wants to talk." It was an unexpected turn of events. The teacher couldn't understand why. After all these years, she had decided to contact him, but he felt that this meeting could be crucial. He agreed without hesitation. When they met the next day in a small cafe, the teacher no longer saw the little girl who had come to school barefoot. In front of him sat a grown-up girl with tired eyes and a hard look. Her face was beautiful, but exhausted, as if every pain she had lived through had left its mark. "I didn't think you'd come," she said, not looking him in the eye. The teacher quietly replied, "Of course I came. I always remembered you." Her lips trembled slightly, as if she were trying to contain her emotions. "You know, when I was little, I thought that someone would come and save me, but with each passing year, I realized more and more that no one would come. I had to learn to survive on my own." She told her story. After running away from her foster family, she found herself on the street, enduring cold nights, trying to find a job, but the world was not kind to her. Those around her offered her easy money, promised to help, but in the end they used her. Everything she had once dreamed of seemed so distant and unattainable. The teacher listened without interrupting. It hurt him to hear this, but it hurt him even more to realize that he had once thought he had done everything he could for her. It turned out that it was not enough. But then, unexpectedly, she said, "However, one thing helped me not to break down completely. I remembered your words about how I deserved more. These words were the only support for me when I was left completely alone." This confession was a revelation to him. It turned out that even in the darkest moments of her life, his kindness and support had not gone unnoticed. The girl who had lost everything continued to cling to one phrase he had said many years ago. It became her anchor. The teacher realized that now before him stood a person who still needed help, but this time she was ready to fight for herself. He offered her help, not in the form of pity, but in the form of real actions: help with housing, find a job, restore documents, and this time she did not reject him. This unexpected turn showed that sometimes even the smallest good deeds can leave a deep mark on someone's life, even if it seems like they have disappeared into thin air. The girl's story did not end in tragedy. It was a story of survival, of struggle, of small victories over the enormous injustice of the world. And though the road to recovery was just beginning, the teacher knew one thing: he wouldn't let her go this time. She had a chance at life again, and now she had the support she deserved from the start. When the teacher offered to help, it was like a ray of light in the endless dark nights of her life for the girl. Now a young woman, despite all the trials, her hope for recovery and a new beginning was just beginning to blossom. She accepted help and began her journey to recovery. The first step was finding temporary housing. The teacher contacted several charities, and within a week she was able to get a small apartment in a safe area of the city. It wasn't luxurious, but it was her own little place, a place where she could start a new life. The teacher helped her find a job. He used his connections to get her a job as an assistant at the local library. Not only did this job provide her with the income she needed, but it also allowed her to surround herself with books, which became her refuge and source of comfort. She began to feel like a part of society again, and she was slowly returning to normal life. However, her difficulties were not over. Memories of the past did not leave her. She often faced nightmares and anxiety attacks. The teacher organized sessions with a psychotherapist for her to help her cope with deep psychological trauma. The work was difficult and painful, but she was ready to fight for her future. Soon, her efforts began to pay off. She discovered new passions, like drawing and volunteering at a local shelter, which helped her find a sense of purpose and fulfillment. Her teacher was there to support her every step of the way. Together, they worked to create a small outreach program for women in difficult situations, to provide them with support and guidance on the path to recovery. But life, as it often does, brought unexpected changes. One day, as she was walking home from work, she was stopped by a young woman who turned out to be an old friend from her foster home. The woman was in terrible shape. Her clothes were shabby, and her face was gaunt. She told me that her life had gone wrong after her house burned down in a fire and she had to leave everything she had. The encounter was a blow to the girl. Once again, she was confronted with the fact that her past was not letting her go, and those who were her tribesmen now needed help. But this time, she was in a position to help. Instead of turning away, she offered to help the woman, providing her with temporary housing and support. Time passed, and the girl, now an adult woman, began not only to build her life, but also to help others. She entered the rhythm of a new existence and became a symbol of overcoming difficulties. She even began to teach other people, helping them to avoid the mistakes that she once made. Her experience became an important lesson for many. One day, when a teacher came to her small celebration for her first year of working in the library, he saw how her life had begun to take shape into something beautiful and positive. She was full of energy, joy, and hope. The people she supported spoke of her with great respect and gratitude. At the celebration, when she gave a speech, she looked at the teacher and said, "I always thought my life was doomed, but you showed me that it is possible to fight for the light. Even when everything seems dark, my story did not end in tragedy, because thanks to you, it has gained new meaning. I learned to help others, and this became part of my recovery." The teacher felt a sense of satisfaction and pride return to his heart. He knew that the girl's story was not perfect, life rarely is, but he also knew that his support and her own strength had led to a change that began with a small spark of hope. The story of the girl, now a woman, turned out to be not only about survival, but also about finding the strength and courage within yourself to become the kind of person who can help others. And that was the essence of her journey, not just recovery, but the creation of something greater, a new path for herself and for those who need support. Life seemed to be getting better for the young woman, but her past continued to haunt her even as her future began to take shape. With each new victory came old demons that never seemed to leave her. A year after her job at the library, her life was shaken again. She received an unexpected letter from the shelter where she had spent her last months before being placed with a foster family. The letter said that her younger brother had been arrested for breaking the law and was in conflict with the authorities. His life had taken the same path she had tried so hard to avoid. In an effort to help her brother, she was drawn back into the world she had tried to escape. She found him in trouble for petty theft and misbehavior. As a teenager, he had become involved with people who exploited his vulnerability. This man, her brother, who had once been her rock, was now at the heart of a criminal underworld she had only guessed at. When she learned of this, she again turned to the teacher for help. He was shocked by the new difficulties his former student was facing. Together they began to look for ways to help her brother, but life on the streets and in a criminal environment had left its mark on him. She visited him in the correctional facility, but his reaction was full of anger and alienation. "Why didn't you leave me here?" he asked, looking at her with hatred and distrust. "I would have been better off if I had stayed here. I had no choice but to enter this life, otherwise I would have been trampled." Those words were like a knife in her heart. She knew that his life had not turned out this way because of him, but he was not ready to accept it. The situation with her brother was another page in her book of suffering, which she tried so hard to turn over. The teacher, helping her in her quest to reconnect with her brother, arranged a meeting with a lawyer and offered to help her rehabilitate. However, each step was painful and slow. Her brother found himself in a difficult situation. His criminal connections, accumulated over the years, led to his case becoming complex and protracted. With each passing month, the fight for her brother's future became more and more time-consuming and demanding. The young woman was once again faced with the fact that she could not change the past, but she tried to do everything she could to create at least some chance of a better future for him. She organized funds for his legal assistance, tried to get his sentence reduced, and involved community organizations to help him rehabilitate. But her own life was also beginning to fall apart. The stress and worry about her brother, the financial strain, and the demands of her job at the library were beginning to wear her down. She began to feel overwhelmed and exhausted, and her old fears and worries were returning. She couldn't sleep at night, and her emotional state was deteriorating. She began to avoid people, including her teacher. The internal pressure and fear led to her almost losing touch with her surroundings. The teacher tried to support her, but every time he came, she became more closed and distant. One day, she found a letter again. This time, it was a notice that her brother had been seriously injured in prison after a conflict with another inmate. He was in critical condition and needed urgent medical attention. The news was a blow she could not bear. As her brother fought for his life in the hospital, she herself was on the verge of collapse. All her energy, all her strength was exhausted. The teacher, seeing her condition, offered to help organize her temporary rest and treatment. She agreed, realizing that she could not continue in this state. A few weeks passed and her brother, thanks to medical efforts and support, began to recover. The young woman, in the process of rehabilitation, was able to regain her strength and rebuild her life. She realized that her fight for her brother was important, but she also needed to take care of herself so that she could help him in the future. When her brother finally came back to life, with a new chance at a future, their relationship began to heal. They began working together to right the wrongs of the past and build a new life. The teacher continued to be their rock, helping them both find their way to recovery and a new life. Their story ended not with an ending, but with the beginning of a new chapter. A young woman and her brother, who had endured many trials and dramas, began their lives anew, armed with the knowledge that even in the darkest moments, one can find hope and the opportunity to change one's destiny. As the young woman and her brother began to recover, they realized their lives had changed forever. Now, as they stood on the brink of a new beginning, their past and future were intertwined, and they had to learn to work together to build something more sustainable. Despite their efforts, problems continued to haunt them. Their economic situation was precarious, and they were constantly looking for a stable income. The young woman returned to work at the library, but her old position was already taken, so she took temporary jobs at several places to cover expenses. She also started a small business selling handicrafts to earn extra income. The brother, after his release, was determined to start a new life. He enrolled in vocational training courses and tried to find stable work, but his criminal record and physical injuries created barriers to employment. Despite this, he remained optimistic and determined to change his life. The problems did not end with financial difficulties. As the young woman and her brother began to recover, their relationships with others remained difficult. The brother, who had experienced harsh conditions in prison, had difficulty adapting socially. He found it difficult to adjust to normal life, and his behavior often became tense. The young woman, trying to support him, also faced psychological difficulties, unable to fully relax and trust people. The teacher, understanding how much they needed support, continued to be there for them. He organized support groups and counseling sessions with psychologists who could help them cope with anxiety and recover from psychological trauma. He also organized activities for their social integration, helping them find friends and support in the community. One day, while they were preparing for an important job interview for their brother, another shock came. The local newspaper published an article about criminal activity in their area, in which their brother's name was mentioned as a potential witness in an old case. This caused a huge public outcry, and the brother was once again in the public eye. The situation led to him losing several potential jobs and becoming the subject of gossip and suspicion. The young woman, unable to cope with the increasing pressure, found herself stressed again. Their efforts to recover began to seem futile and they began to doubt their abilities. The teacher, noticing the deterioration of his charges, arranged an urgent meeting with a public figure who was willing to support them and change public perception. This man was an activist working for the rights of people in difficult situations and could help them restore their reputation. Together, they worked to create a public campaign that would help change the public's perception of their brother and show that he deserved a second chance. At the same time, they organized a fundraiser to cover legal expenses and help their brother find work on a project aimed at helping others who had gone through difficult circumstances. After several months of hard work, public opinion began to change. People began to understand that behind every crime there is a story, and that everyone has the right to recovery and a chance at a new life. The brother was given the opportunity to work in a social project that allowed him to help others and use his experience to support those who found themselves in similar situations. The young woman, despite all the trials, regained her strength and began to feel part of society again. She continued her work at the library and expanded her handicraft business. She also began writing about her experiences to help other people who had experienced trauma and to inspire them to fight for their future. The teacher, watching their lives change, felt a sense of accomplishment in having made an impact. He knew that his role was only part of a bigger picture, and that the real power lay in helping people find their own paths to recovery. The story of a young woman and her brother, full of difficulties and trials, ended not with an end, but with a new beginning. Their path was difficult, but they found the strength not only to cope with the past, but also to create a future full of hope and opportunity. This story reminded everyone that even in the darkest moments, you can always find light and the opportunity to change your destiny. Just when life seemed to be looking up for the young woman and her brother, they discovered that their greatest challenge was yet to come. They had overcome adversity, found support, and forged a new future. But their lives were subject to unexpected challenges that would soon destroy everything they had worked for. The young woman was absorbed in her work at the library and running her own business. She became increasingly involved in community projects and wrote articles about support and recovery for local publications. Her brother, with the support and help of the community, began to settle into a new job, helping others and finding meaning in his life. They both felt that they were finally starting to build something stable and positive. However, one day, after receiving a strange letter from an unknown address, their world began to collapse. The letter said that they had an old debt that needed to be paid off immediately. At first glance, this seemed strange, since they did not remember any debts. The letter contained threats and hinted at hidden information that could destroy their lives. The young woman, troubled by the letter, decided to investigate its origin. She sought help from her lawyer and discovered that the letter was related to an old case involving her foster family, in which her brother was involved. It turned out that the foster family was part of a complex fraud and tax evasion scheme. Eventually, it was discovered that her brother had been a witness in the case and was now at the center of a complex legal conflict. An unexpected turn of events led to the young woman and her brother being caught up in a legal battle over a major financial scheme. They had to face powerful adversaries who not only tried to cover their tracks, but also used every resource at their disposal to discredit them and silence them. The case became even more complicated when it was discovered that key evidence that could have helped their case was hidden. In an attempt to find out the truth and protect their interests, the young woman and her brother began investigating. They discovered that their foster family had connections to high-profile criminals and politicians who were involved in corruption schemes. In the midst of this investigation, they became the target of persecution. Someone began to blackmail them, sending threatening messages and even tried to intimidate them. One evening, after returning home, the young woman discovered that her apartment had been broken into. Although nothing was stolen, this event served as a clear warning. The teacher, upon learning of the situation, came to the rescue again. He used his connections and resources to help them find a way to defend themselves. Together, they began working to create a publicity stunt, drawing media and public attention to their case. The teacher used his skills and connections to push their story into the spotlight and draw attention to the abuses they were investigating. But the further they went, the more difficult the obstacles became. Suddenly, when they were about to make an important announcement at a press conference, the young woman received another letter. This time, it was not a threat, but a touching confession. The letter said that her foster family was, in fact, part of a government welfare program, and they were using it as a cover for more serious operations. The letter was signed with a mysterious name. With this new revelation, they discovered that the foster family was involved in hidden government programs and activities that they had no idea about. This revelation came as a shock and gave them new leads to investigate. It turned out that their lives were part of a larger conspiracy that was using them as pawns in its game. The young woman and her brother decided to uncover the truth and bring everything to light. They teamed up with human rights organizations and worked to create compelling evidence. They also brought in independent journalists and investigators to corroborate their findings. Eventually, after months of hard work and struggle, they managed to expose the scheme, which involved high-profile individuals. The public disclosure shocked the public and led to many arrests and prosecutions. Their fight for the truth led to significant changes in the system and began reforms. The story of the young woman and her brother ended on a positive note. They became symbols of the fight for truth and justice, and their efforts were recognized and respected. They were able to not only overcome their own difficulties, but also help change society for the better. The teacher felt a deep sense of pride as he watched them overcome their challenges and become heroes. Their story was not just about struggling against adversity, but about courage, determination, and a desire for justice that allowed them to change their lives and the world around them. When the shadows of the conspiracy cleared and the public learned the truth, the young woman and her brother became not only heroes, but also the subject of global attention. Their story of fighting corruption and restoring justice inspired many, but their lives were not yet completely at peace. While their reputation and public recognition grew, the hidden threats did not go away. It turned out that there were many people in their case who had lost their positions and influence due to the revelations. These forces began to act in the shadows to take revenge. Their new status only attracted the attention of those who wanted to regain their influence and power at any cost. One day, after returning home from a successful public event dedicated to their struggle, the young woman and her brother found their apartment empty. There were no signs of a break-in, no obvious clues. This was done to sow fear and remind them that they were not protected. It was a personal warning from those connected to their old case. The teacher, concerned about the new developments, offered them enhanced security and help in organizing a safe place to stay. He also contacted several human rights organizations to ensure their protection and create a plan to deal with potential threats. They soon received information that their persecutors had begun to formulate a new plan to discredit them and undermine their efforts. Rumors that they might be involved in even more serious crimes began to circulate in the media and on the internet. False accusations and disinformation appeared, aimed at destroying their reputation. The young woman and her brother decided not to give in to the provocations and continued their work. They teamed up with independent journalists who began their own investigation to uncover the true motives and actions of their persecutors. In the process, they discovered that the corruption plots involved a network of influence that extended far beyond their initial case. One day, when a young woman received an anonymous call about a possible attempt on their lives. Her brother, feeling the need to protect her and himself, decided to investigate on his own. He secretly watched the people who might be involved in these threats and soon discovered that one of their close allies was a traitor. This person was connected to a criminal organization and was trying to use their trust to frame them. At a critical moment, when the betrayal became obvious, they organized a counter-operation to expose the traitor and prevent a new conspiracy. They managed to collect enough evidence to hand it over to law enforcement agencies, which led to the arrest of key figures involved in organizing the crimes. However, this was not all. After these events, the traitor began to blackmail them, threatening to reveal personal and compromising details that could ruin their lives. The new threats made them even more determined. The young woman and her brother again turned to the teacher and his contacts for help. Together, they developed a plan to protect them from all potential attacks and ensure their long-term safety. They also began working on a new program to support victims of corruption and injustice, to help others in similar situations. As their efforts gained public attention and human rights organizations, they were able to strengthen their position and secure protection. Their support program received international recognition and support, enabling them not only to rebuild their lives, but also to make a meaningful contribution to the fight against corruption and injustice. The story of the young woman and her brother continued as an epic of struggle and triumph. They learned to live in constant vigilance, but this also allowed them to become symbols of strength and steadfastness. Their lives became the embodiment of the idea that even in the darkest and most dangerous situations, light and hope can be found if you fight for truth and justice. Their bond with their teacher remained strong, and he continued to be their support and friend. They worked together on new initiatives and projects to support others who found themselves in difficult situations. Their story, full of drama and surprises, ended not only with justice being restored, but also with a new beginning for many people striving for a better future. Despite their recovery and new life, the young woman and her brother continued to face challenges. Their efforts to expose corruption and support victims of injustice attracted international attention, but also made them targets for those who sought to keep their secret affairs a secret. One day, as they were returning home after a successful meeting with representatives of an international human rights organization, their lives changed again. The young woman received a mysterious package with no return address. Inside was an old diary with entries concerning her foster family and their involvement in conspiracies. Attached to the diary was a note warning her of impending danger if she did not stop her efforts to expose them. The diary entries contained details they had not previously known. It turned out that her foster family was not only involved in corruption schemes, but also involved in large-scale operational crimes aimed at manipulating government structures. This information was so sensitive that its climax could change the course of political events on the international stage. They decided to hand over the diary to their trusted people and start investigating. Their cooperation with independent journalists and human rights organizations allowed them to gain access to hidden data, and they discovered that their adopted family had connections to secret organizations that controlled important international resources. However, this discovery led to a new level of threats. The secret organization, having learned that their plans were being revealed, began to act aggressively. One night, after another escalation of threats, their home was attacked again, but this time they were kidnapped. When a young woman and her brother, trying to escape, found themselves detained and placed in an abandoned building outside the city, their terror and fear reached their limit. Suddenly, as they were trying to find a way out, a man in the shadows approached them. It was an old acquaintance of theirs who had once helped them at the beginning of their struggle. He told them that secret organizations had decided to use them as scapegoats to divert attention from their actions and hide the truth. Trapped, they learned that this old acquaintance was a double agent working for the organization, but also a genuine sympathizer with their cause. He provided them with an escape plan and helped them devise a strategy to expose the conspirators. Together, they were able to escape the building and contact the teacher and human rights groups, who launched an emergency rescue operation. Meanwhile, the secret organization, realizing that their plans had been exposed, began active efforts to destroy all evidence of their crimes. They launched major raids on key facilities associated with the organization to cover their tracks and eliminate witnesses. The situation became extremely tense, and their allies became targets for attacks. At this critical moment, the young woman and her brother, using their knowledge from the diary, identified key vulnerabilities in the organization. They arranged emergency meetings with international investigators and provided them with all the information they had gathered, including classified documents and evidence that allowed them to uncover the criminal network on a global scale. After intensive investigations and international operations, the secret organization was exposed and its leaders were arrested. Their actions led to major political and legal changes, and the international community began to implement reforms to prevent similar conspiracies in the future. The young woman and her brother returned to their lives, but their struggle left an indelible mark. Their work attracted the attention of many people, and they became prominent figures in the international fight for truth and justice. They continued their projects and work in human rights organizations, helping others cope with difficulties and overcome injustice. The teacher, still supporting them, was proud that their story had inspired many to take action and created the opportunity for significant change. Their journey had been full of dramatic twists and turns and dangers, but ultimately they had created something more than just justice. They had created a new reality in which the fight for truth and justice had become a powerful tool for change in the world. Their story continued as a symbol of courage, determination and fortitude, inspiring many to fight for their right to justice and fairness. Every day was a new challenge, but they now knew that even in the darkest and most dangerous situations, there was a way to find the light and create a future full of hope and opportunity. Despite the end of the investigation and the exposure of the secret organization, the young woman and her brother felt that their lives were still under threat, although they had restored their reputations and continued their work on human rights projects. The shadow of their past still threatened their safety. One day, while they were at a human rights conference discussing new anti-corruption initiatives, they noticed that they were being followed. This feeling of suspicion was confirmed when another threatening letter appeared in their personal inbox, telling them that their efforts to expose a criminal organization had attracted the attention of forces far more powerful and dangerous than they could have imagined. This new level of threat left them with no choice. They decided to seek help from security experts and began to carefully check their surroundings. It turned out that the people spying on them were connected to a global network of criminals working in the shadows, who were looking to regain their positions and get revenge for being exposed. However, the most terrifying events unfolded when they discovered that their old friend and ally, who turned out to be a double agent, was involved in even more dangerous schemes. It turned out that he was part of an international network working for corporate monsters who use corruption and manipulation to achieve their goals. To combat the new threat, the young woman and her brother decided to use their connections and knowledge to create a sophisticated operation to expose the international network. They began collaborating with various human rights and investigative groups around the world, joining forces to identify and destroy the criminal network. During the investigation, they learned that a criminal network was planning a major operation to manipulate elections in several countries in order to change the political landscape and strengthen their influence. They began collecting evidence and documenting the connections between high-profile politicians, corporations, and criminal groups. But the more they uncovered, the more their lives became threatened. Suddenly, when they organized an international press conference to release the materials they had collected, they were faced with an unexpected turn of events. During the event, one of the leading journalists who had previously supported their cause turned out to be an undercover agent working for a criminal network. He sabotaged the conference and tried to destroy evidence to prevent the revelation. The young woman and her brother found themselves in the most difficult situation, with their efforts to uncover the truth being threatened from multiple sides. They quickly organized an evacuation and went into hiding, taking precautions and leaving false trails to confuse their pursuers. At a moment of crisis, when the situation seemed on the brink of disaster, the teacher and his network of allies who had worked with them throughout their struggle stepped in. They used their resources and influence to keep the young woman and her brother safe and to organize international cooperation that helped them avoid further threats. With this new level of support and the revelations of information that involved global manipulation and corruption, human rights organizations and international bodies began to actively combat the criminal network. There were numerous arrests, prosecutions, and reforms aimed at preventing similar abuses in the future. When the storm passed, the young woman and her brother returned to their lives, but their stories and actions left an indelible mark on the world stage. They continued their human rights work and became important figures in the international fight for truth and justice. Their personal safety was ensured, but they remained on the front lines of the fight against those who sought to use corruption and manipulation for their own ends. The teacher, seeing how their story became a symbol of hope and struggle, felt proud to have been able to help in such a critical moment. He continued to support them and help them in their mission, knowing that every day they were taking important steps towards creating a better world. The story of a young woman and her brother became an epic tale of resilience, courage, and dedication. They learned that even in the darkest and most dangerous situations, when all seems lost, you can find a way to change the world for the better. Every day was a new challenge, but their determination and fortitude helped them overcome any obstacle and leave a legacy that inspires many to fight for justice and truth. Just when it seemed that some calm was on the horizon and the young woman and her brother were beginning to rebuild their lives after the escalating crises, their world was once again rocked by an unexpected and tragic turn of events. After months of hiding and working to expose an international crime network, they finally began to feel a little stability, but this illusion of safety was short-lived. One day, during an ordinary day, their lives were shattered by a new shock. A young woman received a terrifying message. Her brother, who continued to work on human rights projects and activism, had disappeared. This happened just after he was about to meet with important international partners to discuss further steps in the fight against corruption. He was not there, and his phone was switched off. Initially, they thought that he might have been held up by an accident or a delay, but when several more days went by and the trail led nowhere, anxiety and fear began to mount. The young woman, unsure of what to do, turned to her allies and her teacher for help, but their efforts to find her brother were fruitless. The situation worsened when news broke that a body had been found that matched her brother's description. Upon discovering the body, the young woman and teacher, as well as several trusted people, confirmed that it was indeed her brother. He had died a violent death, leaving behind only emptiness and unspeakable pain. Her world was shattered. This tragedy not only took away the person she loved, but also put her own safety at risk. Together with her teacher and her team, they began an investigation to find out who was behind this terrible crime. They faced new threats and realized that the criminal network they were exposing had not ignored their actions. These forces will stop at nothing to protect their interests. Seeking justice and vengeance for her brother's death, the young woman threw herself into the investigation. Working around the clock and using all her connections and resources, she discovered that her brother had been targeted because of his closeness to international human rights work, and that his death had been planned as a means of intimidating her and other activists. At the same time, her own life was in danger. The criminal network began eliminating everyone who was involved in exposing their activities. The young woman and her allies survived several assassination attempts, and she realized that their fight was becoming increasingly dangerous. In this darkness, a new and unexpected ally emerged, a former member of the criminal network who, having experienced internal conflict, decided to help the young activists in their quest for justice. This person provided important information about the criminals' plans and future goals, which helped to create a strategy to neutralize them. Armed with new knowledge and determination, the young woman launched a massive operation to expose the remaining members of the criminal network and their plans. She was able to gather enough evidence for international law enforcement agencies, who eventually made large-scale arrests and neutralized key criminals. Although she achieved justice for her brother and made a significant contribution to the fight against international corruption, the personal loss left a deep wound in her life. She continued her work, but every day was a reminder of the pain of loss. Her brother became a symbol of the sacrifice of the fight for truth and justice. Her brother's story in her own life became a lesson to many about the high price of fighting the system. she continued to inspire others with her resilience and determination, and her human rights work brought attention to important issues that remain on the agenda. The teacher who had supported her throughout her journey felt a deep sadness at her loss, but also pride that the young woman had been able to turn her pain into strength and continue her work. He knew that despite the tragedy, they had left an indelible mark on the world, and that the fight for truth and justice would continue, inspiring others to take action and change. After the tragic death of her brother, a young woman found herself at the intersection of personal tragedy and professional duty. She continued to work on human rights projects, but the shadow of loss and the constant threat to her safety made her life unbearably difficult. One day, during a normal workday, she received an anonymous message with a video recording. It was of her brother, who, to her horror, looked alive and well. It was a shocking turn of events. The video suggested that her brother was still alive and being held in a secret location. The message demanded that she fulfill conditions or her brother would be killed. The conditions were harsh. The criminal network demanded that she publicly renounce all her work to expose their crimes and destroy all evidence she had collected. The young woman was torn between her desire to save her brother and her duty to continue fighting for justice. The internal conflict was terrible, but she knew that any step back could endanger not only her life, but the lives of many others she was protecting. She turned to her teacher and trusted allies for help. Together, they began to formulate a plan to save her brother while continuing to fight the criminal network. They used the resources and information they had to find out her brother's location and stage a complex rescue operation. At this time, the criminal network began to attack her person in the media, spreading disinformation and false accusations to destroy her reputation and exert pressure. This media onslaught added to her suffering, but she remained resilient. Together with her team, she and the teacher created false trails and manipulated information to distract the criminals and create a chance for a successful rescue operation. At the same time, they continued to collect evidence of the crimes and hand it over to international law enforcement agencies, who began conducting operations to neutralize the criminal network. The rescue operation for the brother was complex and dangerous. The team developed a plan to infiltrate the place where he was being held. Suddenly, they were faced with an additional threat. One of the team members turned traitor and informed the criminals about the rescue plans. This led to an unexpected confrontation and increased security. At the climax, when the rescue of her brother was on the verge of failure, a tragic turn of events occurred. The young woman, passing through a guarded building, encountered a group of criminals. During the clash, she managed to save her brother, but her own life was in danger. In the fight, she was seriously injured, and despite saving her brother, her condition became critical. The brother, after being released, was shocked by the condition of his sister and immediately called for help. They were able to get to a safe place where she was given first aid. From a medical point of view, her condition was critical, but her salvation was possible thanks to an urgent operation and professional help. After her recovery, which was a long and difficult process, they resumed the fight, but now with a new, deep sense of personal loss and pain. The young woman and her brother were able to successfully complete the investigation and expose the criminal network, but their victory was overshadowed by personal sacrifice. Their struggle left an indelible mark on society. Despite all the hardships, they continued to work in the human rights field, dedicating their lives to supporting other victims and fighting for justice. Their story became a symbol of sacrifice, strength and determination. They became heroic figures in the international fight against corruption and injustice, and their actions inspired many to continue the fight for justice. The teacher, seeing how they overcame the tragedy and continued their mission, felt deep respect and pride. He continued to support them in their activities and helped organize new projects to protect human rights and fight crime. The story of the young woman and her brother ended as an epic tale of courage and resilience in the face of tragedy. Their personal sacrifices and struggles became a lesson to the world about how even in the darkest of times, one can find the strength to continue the fight for truth and justice. They left a legacy that will inspire future generations to fight injustice and defend human rights. After a difficult recovery and return to active life, the young woman and her brother were faced with a new and even more tragic threat that eclipsed all previous trials. Their lives seemed to be regaining stability, but soon their dark past came back to haunt them. While the young woman recovered from her injuries, her brother continued to work on exposing the remaining parts of the criminal network. They were involved in international negotiations on new measures to combat corruption and protect human rights. But during one of these events, their team unexpectedly encountered a new, even more sinister plot. Suddenly, they discovered that they were not the only ones being targeted. At the same time, their loved ones and allies began to receive threats and attacks. One by one, their supporters and friends were being subjected to violence. One of their key allies, who worked for a human rights organization, was killed in a targeted attack aimed at eliminating her. This act of violence further strengthened the young woman and her brother's resolve to fight for justice, but it also left them in a state of deep emotional pain. The situation escalated when an explosion occurred on the day of a human rights conference where new evidence of corruption was to be presented. The attack took place in a room full of participants and journalists at the conference, killing several people, including one of the young woman's trusted allies and her brother. This tragic incident was orchestrated to derail their efforts and intimidate them. The criminal network, realizing that their position was becoming increasingly vulnerable, took extreme measures. The young woman's brother, who was at the center of the events, was caught in the blast, but fortunately survived. However, his condition was serious and he was hospitalized with serious injuries. The young woman was on the verge of a nervous breakdown from the stress and pain of loss. She struggled with depression and fear, but she continued her work, using new evidence to pressure international authorities. Her determination was not weakened, but she was on the verge of emotional exhaustion. In the midst of all these events, they received information about a new, even darker conspiracy involving international politics. It turned out that a criminal network was planning to launch a global campaign of disinformation and manipulation to influence elections in several countries and increase their influence. The young woman and her brother, despite their injuries, decided to join forces with other international human rights organizations and security experts to stop this plot. They developed a plan to expose the criminals' plot and attracted international media attention. During this operation, they faced even greater levels of violence and threats as the criminals attempted to destroy their new evidence and disrupt the anti-manipulation operations. Ultimately, through their teamwork, international coalition, and tireless work, they were able to expose and stop the criminal network's plan. As a result, the international community took active measures to ensure election security and prevent manipulation. But the personal cost was high. The young woman and her brother continued to struggle with internal demons and the physical aftermath. They realized that their efforts and sacrifices had made a significant difference, but the cost was terrible. They were left with deep emotional wounds and physical trauma, and had a hard time coping with the aftermath of all the loss and pain. The story of the young woman and her brother ended in an epic of incredible struggle and tragedy. Their lives were full of trials and suffering, but their actions and determination helped change the world. They became symbols of resilience and courage, and their legacy has inspired many people around the world to continue the fight for justice and human rights. Despite all the obstacles, the teacher and their allies continued to support them as they dealt with and recovered from the tragedies. Despite the difficulties, they found the strength to continue their work, knowing that their sacrifices had brought important change and hope for future generations. After the international community successfully thwarted the massive manipulation and exposed the criminal network, the young woman and her brother returned to their work despite the lasting physical and emotional effects. Their desire to rebuild and continue the fight for the truth remained strong, but their every action was now overshadowed by a deep sense of loss and pain. With the restoration of international order and security, their human rights work became even more important and urgent. However, they faced a new, unexpected challenge. One of the key villains who was part of the criminal network was not fully captured and remained at large. He was an influential politician who used his power and connections to manipulate the situation and maintain his position. the young woman and her brother began receiving information that the politician was planning to return to the international arena under a new name and identity to continue his dark deeds. They discovered that he was organizing new criminal schemes and seeking to restore his position, which could threaten global stability. One day, during one of these troubling days, a young woman received information from an anonymous source who claimed to have evidence that could lead to a political criminal and his new plans. The information came in the form of a series of photographs and recordings that pointed to secret meetings and deals. However, this evidence was heavily distorted and hidden, requiring intensive investigation to decipher and verify it. As the young woman and her brother continued their investigations, they noticed that their actions had attracted the attention of new enemies. The conspirators, aware that their plans were once again under threat, began an active campaign to discredit and sabotage them. Reports of false accusations, threats, and bribery attempts became part of their daily routine, but this did not stop them. The young woman and her brother used all their resources and connections to unravel a complex web of crimes and expose a new political criminal. Their work led to several tense moments and major revelations that shocked the international community. They found evidence of corruption schemes organized by this politician and exposed his connection to an international criminal network. However, their efforts were not without consequences. At one of the most tense moments of their investigation, as they prepared for a public revelation and press conference, tragedy struck. The young woman's brother was kidnapped by a group of assassins sent to finally suppress their efforts and eliminate the threat. This tragedy presented her with the most difficult task of her life. In her search for her brother, she faced even greater dangers and had to use all her skills and connections to find and save him. She organized an emergency rescue operation, using the help of international forces and her allies. During the rescue operation, the young woman, at great risk, found her brother in one of the secret shelters. He was in serious condition, but alive. The rescue was successful, but the brother received serious injuries that required long-term treatment and recovery. After this horrific event, the young woman and her brother, exhausted and devastated, continued their work to expose the criminal network, but now their efforts were directed at creating safer structures and supporting the victims of corruption. They focused on working with international organizations to create systems that could prevent such tragedies from happening again. Their story is an epic tale of struggle, courage, and perseverance in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. They persevered in the face of enormous danger and loss, continuing their mission to protect human rights and expose corruption. Inspired by their experiences, they brought important issues to the forefront and created a platform for change in the global system. The teacher and their allies continued to support them, helping them cope and recover from the tragedies. The young woman and her brother, despite all the trials they had endured, remained steadfast in their fight for truth and justice. Their story embodied the desire for justice and perseverance, demonstrating that even after the darkest times, there is hope for recovery and change. After months of struggle, fear and tragedy, the young woman and her brother have finally reached the happy ending they have been waiting for. The events of the past months, including the kidnapping and rescue, have left a deep mark on their lives, but have also led to important changes and bright prospects. After successfully rescuing and treating her brother, the young woman decided to take a break from her activities to ensure her full recovery and to attend to her personal affairs. They both understood that in order to continue their mission, they needed to regain their strength and improve their personal lives. The recovery process was long, but the support of loved ones, friends and allies, as well as their own determination, helped them cope with the trauma and loss. They began a new life, gradually returning to their work, but now with a new outlook on life and an expanded purpose. Instead of simply fighting crime and corruption, they decided to create a relief fund aimed at supporting victims of violence and helping people in difficult situations. The foundation not only provided practical help to victims, but also became a symbol of hope and recovery. It supported education, rehabilitation and human rights initiatives. The young woman and her brother took an active role in its activities, traveling the world to organize events and raise awareness of important issues. Their work did not go unnoticed. Thanks to their efforts and inspiration, many new activists and organizations joined the cause of fighting corruption and protecting human rights. Their foundation became an international center of change, helping to create new initiatives and programs around the world. With their activities restored, the young woman and her brother were able to find joy and harmony in their personal lives again. They created a strong support system for each other and for those who needed help. Their relationship became even deeper, and they found comfort and happiness in the fact that they were able to overcome difficulties and create something meaningful. Several years passed, and their story was recognized as one of the shining examples of courage and fortitude. They became objects of respect and admiration in society and received many awards for their work, but for them, the most valuable achievement was that they were able to change people's lives for the better and bring hope to those who needed support. At the end of their story, the young woman and her brother, who had survived all the trials and tragedies, found peace and satisfaction in the fact that they had been able to make the world a better place. They continued to work in their field, but now with a sense of deep satisfaction and peace. They understood that their path had been difficult and full of trials, but it had also led them to new heights and brought real change. They lived surrounded by friends and family, enjoying every moment and continuing their work with renewed strength and determination. Their lives were full of joy, collaboration and achievement, and although they knew that their fight for justice was not yet over, they also understood that every step they took was important and meaningful. Ultimately, the young woman and her brother found their way to happiness and harmony, knowing that their work and sacrifices had made a real difference in the lives of many. Their story became an example of the strength of the human spirit and a reminder that even after the darkest times, light and hope can be found. What do you think about our story? Have you ever encountered similar situations in your life or in the lives of your loved ones? We would be very happy to know your opinion and hear your stories in the comments. Every story and every opinion you share is important to us. It helps us understand how we can better support and inspire others. You are part of our community, and your support and participation means a lot to us. If you enjoyed this story and want to keep up with our new videos and projects, be sure to subscribe to our channel. This will help us continue to create quality content and support important discussions.